The massive holographic display cast blue shadows across High Commander Vexithara's scaled features as she reviewed the latest intelligence reports. The Zephyrian hegemony's war room buzzed with quiet efficiency, officers moving between data terminals like dancers in a well-rehearsed performance. For 300 cycles, the hegemony had been the undisputed masters of this galaxy, their bio-enhanced warriors and energy-based weaponry, crushing any species foolish enough to resist their expansion. The report spoke of yet another primitive species discovered in the Outer Rim territories. These humans had recently begun expanding through previously unclaimed systems, establishing crude colonies on barely habitable worlds. Intelligence suggested they possessed no advanced energy weapons, no biotechnology, and certainly no understanding of the greater galactic hierarchy that the hegemony had spent centuries perfecting. Vexthara's 4 eyes scanned the tactical analysis with growing amusement. The humans relied on chemical propulsion for space travel, kinetic weapons for warfare, and appeared to lack even basic genetic enhancement capabilities. Their largest warships were barely the size of a hegemony patrol vessel, and their energy output readings suggested technology that was laughably outdated by galactic standards. Another day, another species that thinks they can claim territory without paying tribute to the hegemony, she mused, her translated voice carrying the arrogance of someone who had never known defeat. Around her, junior officers nodded in agreement, their own bio-enhanced forms shifting uncomfortably in their adaptive armor. The intelligence dossier was thorough but unimpressive. Humans appeared to be a young species, barely having left their home system a few generations ago. They showed signs of internal conflict, with multiple governing bodies and no unified military command. Their weapons were crude projectile-based systems that would be ineffective against hegemony energy shields. Most amusing of all, they seemed to form emotional attachments to their offspring and mates, a weakness that could be easily exploited. Vexithara dismissed the tactical display with a gesture. In her 3 centuries of command, she had overseen the subjugation of over 200 species. The pattern was always the same. First came the demands for tribute and submission, usually ignored by species too primitive to understand their place in the galaxy. Then came the demonstration of superior force, which typically ended any resistance within days. Finally came integration into the hegemony's vast economic and military machine, with the survivors grateful for the privilege of serving their betters. "Deploy the Void Hunters," she commanded, her voice carrying across the war room. 5 should be more than sufficient for this demonstration. The junior officers exchanged glances. 5 Void Hunters for an entire species was generous beyond reason. Each hunter was a master warrior, bio-enhanced and equipped with the most advanced weapons the hegemony could produce. A single hunter had once conquered an entire star system. The selection process was brief. Zexkar, the relentless veteran of 47 campaigns, Thaisar, the silent master of stealth warfare, Krentok the destroyer, whose energy cannons had reduced 3 worlds to ash, Felnoth the swift, undefeated in personal combat, and finally, Morgeth the ancient, eldest of the hunters and Vexithara's own mentor in the art of war. Each hunter stood 3 meters tall, their bodies a fusion of biological perfection and technological enhancement. Neural implants allowed them to process battlefield information faster than any unaugmented mind could comprehend. Their armor was grown rather than manufactured, a living symbiosis of metal and flesh that could adapt to any environment or threat. Energy weapons were integrated directly into their nervous systems, making them as much weapon as warrior. "Your target is the human colony designated New Jamestown," Vexthara informed them as they stood in perfect formation. "Population approximately 50,000. Standard procedure applies. Eliminate all military resistance, secure the leadership, and prepare the survivors for processing. Intelligence suggests they lack any meaningful defensive capabilities." Morgeth, eldest of the hunters, tilted his massive head slightly. "High Commander, with respect, 5 hunters for such a small colony seems excessive. Perhaps 2 would suffice." His voice carried the weight of centuries of experience, but also a subtle concern that only Vexithara recognized. Vexithara's laugh was cold and sharp. "Consider it a training exercise, old friend. The younger hunters need to see how easily these primitive species fall. Let them practice their techniques on targets that cannot possibly threaten them. Besides," she gestured to the tactical display showing human ship movements, Their expansion rate suggests they might become troublesome if left unchecked. Better to crush their ambitions early. The briefing continued with detailed analysis of human psychology, tactics, and technology. Everything suggested this would be the shortest campaign in hegemony history. Humans showed no evidence of advanced shielding technology, no energy weapons capable of penetrating hunter armor, and no tactical doctrine beyond crude formations and predictable strategies. As the hunters prepared for deployment, loading their sleek assault craft with enough firepower to level a small moon, Vexthera allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Soon word would spread throughout the Outer Rim territories about the fate of New Jamestown. Other species would learn that expansion without hegemony approval was not merely forbidden, it was suicidal. The Void Hunter's ship slipped into hyperspace with barely a disturbance, its advanced engines leaving no trace for primitive sensors to detect. In 12 hours, they would arrive at New Jamestown. In 13 hours, the colony would be under hegemony control. By evening, the survivors would be preparing for their new lives as servants of the galaxy's rightful masters. Vexithara returned to her command chamber, already composing the victory report she would send to the Hegemony Council. Another species brought into the fold, another demonstration of hegemony superiority. She had no way of knowing that she was about to lose 5 of the most elite warriors the galaxy had ever produced to a species that understood warfare in ways the hegemony had never imagined. In the depths of space, the Hunter assault craft continued its journey toward New Jamestown, carrying 5 warriors who had never known defeat toward an encounter that would redefine their understanding of what it meant to fight for survival. The humans were waiting, though they didn't know it yet, and they would teach the hegemony a lesson that would echo across the galaxy. Never underestimate a species that has spent its entire history learning to kill its own kind. BR. Stage was set for first contact between the galaxy's most dominant predator and a species that had turned predation into an art form. Only one side would walk away from New Jamestown, and it wouldn't be the one that considered victory a foregone conclusion. The Void Hunter assault craft descended through New Jamestown's atmosphere like a falling star, its energy signature masked by advanced stealth technology that had never failed to provide the element of surprise. Below them, the human colony spread across rolling hills and river valleys, a patchwork of agricultural zones, industrial facilities, and residential districts that looked pathetically vulnerable from orbit. Zexkar studied the tactical display with the confidence of a predator observing prey. Standard formation. Thaisara takes the eastern perimeter. I'll handle the central government complex. Krentok. Suppress their communication arrays first, then move to the spaceport. Velnoth and Morgoth will sweep the residential sectors and secure the population centers. The plan was flawless by hegemony standards. Divide the enemy's attention, eliminate their ability to coordinate, and systematically crush all resistance. It had worked against 200 other species. There was no reason to believe these humans would be any different. Thisera was the first to reach her assigned position, her bio-enhanced form moving through the forest with predatory grace. Her sensory implants detected human life signs scattered throughout the woodland area. Guards, perhaps, or scouts. She smiled behind her helmet. They had no idea she was there. Her energy rifle powered up with a soft hum, ready to announce the hegemony's arrival with overwhelming force. She never saw the human sniper. Marcus Chen had been lying motionless in his carefully prepared hide for 3 days, waiting for something he couldn't name but somehow knew would come. The colony's defense coordinator had called him paranoid when he'd requested permission to establish overwatch positions in the forest. We're not at war with anyone, they'd said, but Marcus had been a soldier before he'd been a colonist, and something about the recent silence from other Outer Rim settlements made his instincts scream warnings. When the alien appeared in his scope, moving with inhuman grace through the underbrush, Marcus felt his heart rate settle into the steady rhythm he'd learned in combat zones across 3 worlds. The target was large, armored, and clearly hostile. The weapon it carried was unlike anything in the colonial defense arsenal, but the way it moved, the way it scanned for threats, this was a soldier, and soldiers Marcus understood. The shot was perfect. The modified hunting rifle bucked against his shoulder, sending a tungsten core round through 800 meters of forest air to punch through the alien's helmet with devastating precision. Thisera the Silent, master of stealth warfare, Veteran of 30 campaigns, died before she could process what had killed her. Across the colony, the remaining 4 hunters felt their first teammates' life signs vanish from their tactical display. The impossible had happened. One of their own was gone, killed by weapons that should have been incapable of penetrating hunter armor. Krentok reached the communication facility first, his massive form easily tearing through the chain-link fence that surrounded the compound. His integrated energy cannons charged up, ready to reduce the transmission towers to molten slag. But as he approached the main building, something felt wrong. The facility was too quiet, too empty. The explosion that consumed him was not sophisticated by galactic standards, simple chemical explosives, triggered by pressure plates that the fleeing human technicians had hidden under debris. But the blast was channeled perfectly, turning the communication building into a shaped charge that caught Krentok in a killing zone of concrete and flame. As the smoke cleared, the humans emerged from hidden positions throughout the facility. They moved with purpose, checking their improvised defenses and resupplying from concealed weapon caches. These weren't trained soldiers, they were farmers, technicians, teachers who had spent the last few days learning to kill with whatever tools they could find. 2 down, Sarah Martinez whispered into her comm unit, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. She had been the colony's civil engineer before today. Now she was coordinating the defense of her home using principles learned from military construction manuals and a desperate creativity born of necessity. Vel Nuth the Swift received the transmission in disbelief. 2 hunters dead in the first minutes of engagement. It was impossible, but the evidence was undeniable. He changed his approach, abandoning the direct assault tactics that had served him for decades in favor of a more cautious advance. The residential district appeared deserted as he moved through the streets, his enhanced senses detecting traces of human presence but no immediate threats. Windows stared down at him like dead eyes, and debris littered the roadways as if the population had fled in panic. This was more familiar territory, frightened civilians abandoning their homes to superior force. The first indication that something was wrong came when his foot triggered a simple tripwire, connected to an improvised explosive device hidden in a storm drain. The blast wasn't enough to kill him, but it staggered him, damaged his left leg, and filled the air with smoke and debris. That's when the humans attacked. They came from every direction at once, rooftops, basements, alleys, and storm drains. Not as individuals, but as a coordinated pack. They used weapons that shouldn't have been effective, modified tools, hunting equipment, improvised explosives. But they used them with a tactical understanding that caught Velnoth completely off guard. A welder's torch became a close-range flame weapon. Farming equipment was turned into entangling snares. Even the children participated, throwing rocks and debris to distract and confuse while the adults moved in for killing strikes. Velnoth fought with all the skill and enhancement that 2 centuries of warfare had given him. His energy weapons carved through buildings and streets. His armor turned aside most of the primitive attacks. But there were so many of them, and they fought with an intensity that bordered on madness. Every time he killed one, 2 more seemed to take their place. The end came when a teenage girl named Lisa Park crawled through the rubble with a satchel charge strapped to her back. She had lost her parents in the first explosion, and her young mind had processed grief into a cold, calculating fury that Velnoth's psychological profiles couldn't have predicted. "For my family," she whispered, and detonated the charge at point-blank range. Morgoth and Zexkar found themselves alone in a colony that had become a killing field. Around them, humans continued to move through the ruins with purpose and coordination that defied everything the hegemony knew about primitive species. These weren't soldiers, they were something worse. They were a people fighting for their homes, their families, their right to exist. "This is not how warfare works," Morgoth transmitted to his remaining partner, his voice carrying centuries of confusion. "They should have surrendered after our first demonstration of superior firepower. They should be begging for terms." Zexkar watched through his scope as humans moved through the smoke and debris, carrying their wounded to safety while simultaneously preparing new ambush positions. "I don't think they understand the concept of surrender," he replied, the first seeds of fear beginning to grow in his enhanced mind. As night fell over New Jamestown, the 2 surviving hunters began to comprehend the magnitude of their miscalculation. They had come to conquer a primitive species with superior technology and centuries of military experience. Instead, they had stumbled into a fight with something that the galaxy had never seen before, a species that treated warfare not as a political tool, but as a matter of survival. The humans weren't just defending a colony. They were protecting everything they had built, everyone they loved, and everything they hoped to become. And they would kill anything that threatened those things, no matter the cost to themselves. 3 void hunters were dead, and the night was just beginning. Dawn broke over New Jamestown like a wound bleeding light across the scarred landscape. Morgoth the Ancient crouched behind the twisted remains of what had once been a school, his bio-enhanced eyes scanning the eerily quiet streets for any sign of movement. 3 of his fellow hunters were dead, killed by a species that should have been helpless against their superior technology. Zexkar, he transmitted on the secure channel, I'm reading multiple heat signatures moving through the tunnel system beneath the colony. They're using the infrastructure against us. His voice carried a note that would have been impossible to imagine 12 hours earlier. Uncertainty. Zexkar's reply came through static filled with interference from something the humans had done to their communication satellites. The primitive weapons are more effective than anticipated. My armor has sustained significant damage from their chemical explosives. These creatures fight without regard for tactical doctrine or personal safety. What the 2 hunters didn't understand was that below their feet, the surviving colonists were moving through maintenance tunnels and storm drains in a coordinated evacuation that doubled as a tactical repositioning. Sarah Martinez had spent the night turning the colony's civil engineering plans into a battlefield map, identifying choke points, kill zones, and escape routes with the methodical precision of someone fighting for the lives of everyone she had ever cared about. Team 7, you're clear to move through Junction C4, she whispered into her comm. Medical personnel and non-combatants continue to Evacuation Point Delta. Combat teams, prepare Phase 2. The, woman who had designed water treatment plants and residential districts was now orchestrating a defensive strategy that would have impressed military commanders across human space. Phase 2 was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. If the aliens wanted to glass the colony from orbit, the humans would force them to come down and fight on the ground. And on the ground, the humans had advantages that no amount of bioenhancement could overcome. They knew every inch of their home. They fought for reasons the aliens couldn't comprehend, and they had nothing left to lose. Morgoth was moving through the industrial district when the ground beneath him simply disappeared. The maintenance shaft that opened under his feet had been weakened by precisely placed charges, turning solid concrete into a trap that sent him plummeting into darkness. He landed hard in a drainage tunnel, his bio-enhanced reflexes saving him from serious injury, but leaving him disoriented in an environment where his technological advantages meant nothing. The humans were waiting for him. They came at him from both ends of the tunnel simultaneously, moving in groups of 3 or 4 with a coordination that spoke of countless hours of planning and preparation. They carried weapons that should have been laughable. Farming tools converted to stabbing implements, industrial equipment turned into improvised firearms, even rocks and debris used with lethal precision. But it was the way they fought that shattered Morgoth's understanding of warfare. They didn't retreat when he fired his energy weapons. They didn't break formation when he killed their companions. Instead, they used their fallen comrades as cover, as distractions, as stepping stones to get closer to their target. They fought like a pack of predators, each individual willing to sacrifice themselves to create opportunities for the others. This is impossible, Morgoth gasped as a modified welding torch burned through his armor plating. You're primitives. You don't understand the first principles of civilized warfare. Old Pete Kowalski, who had spent 40 years maintaining the colony's power grid before this day, looked up at the alien warrior with eyes that held no fear, only a cold determination that came from seeing his granddaughter's school reduced to rubble. Civilized? He asked, pressing the trigger on his improvised flame weapon. Son, we've been killing each other for thousands of years. You picked a fight with the wrong species. Above ground, Zexkar had reached the same terrible conclusion. His attempt to reach the colony's command center had turned into a running battle through streets that had become a maze of traps, ambushes, and kill zones. The humans weren't just defending their colony. They were hunting him with the patience and skill of apex predators. Every building could conceal a sniper. Every intersection might be mined with explosives. Every piece of debris could hide a trap designed to cripple or kill. The humans had turned their entire settlement into a weapon, and they wielded it with devastating effectiveness. But it was the children that truly broke his comprehension of how warfare should work. They should have been cowering in shelters, begging for mercy, crying for their parents. Instead, they moved through the ruins like ghosts, carrying messages, supplies, and sometimes weapons. They watched him with eyes that held no innocence, no fear, only a calculating intelligence that evaluated him as a threat to be eliminated. "Command, this is Zexkar," he transmitted, his voice strained as he took cover behind an overturned vehicle. "We need immediate orbital support. These creatures are not behaving according to any known psychological profile. They're fighting with total commitment, showing no regard for survival instinct or preservation of non-combatants." The response that came back was garbled by jamming signals that the humans had somehow established using their primitive electronics, but the message was clear. Orbital bombardment was not authorized until the hunters could confirm the location of valuable resources and potential slaves. In the tunnels below, Morgoth's desperate fight was reaching its conclusion. His energy weapons had carved through dozens of attackers, but for every human he killed, 2 more seemed to take their place. His armor was breached in a dozen locations. His bio-enhanced body was running on combat stimulants and desperation, and still they came. The end came when Maria Santos, the colony's head teacher, crawled through a ventilation shaft with a backpack full of mining explosives. She had spent the last 6 hours watching her students and colleagues die defending their homes. She had seen enough. "For the children," she whispered, and pulled the detonator. The explosion collapsed 50 meters of tunnel system, taking Morgoth the Ancient with it. 400 years of combat experience, bio-enhancement, and technological superiority ended in a burst of chemical fire and falling stone, defeated by a school teacher with a backpack bomb. Zexkar felt his mentor's death through their shared tactical network, and for the first time in his century of service to the hegemony, he knew fear. Not the tactical concern of a professional soldier, but the primal terror of prey being hunted by something that understood killing better than he ever would. Around him, the ruins of New Jamestown settled into an ominous quiet. The humans were still there. He could feel them watching from 100 hidden positions, but they had stopped their active pursuit. Instead, they were waiting, patient as spiders in their web, for him to make the mistake that would end his life. Zexkar activated his emergency beacon and began transmitting everything he had learned about these impossible creatures. The message would take hours to reach High Commander Vexithera, but perhaps it would prevent other hegemony forces from making the same catastrophic mistake. "This is Commander Zexkar, last surviving member of Void Hunter Strike Team. The species designated human does not conform to any known psychological or tactical parameters. They do not surrender, they do not retreat. They do not distinguish between combatants and non-combatants in their defensive strategies. Every member of their population is a potential soldier." He paused, watching shadows move through the rubble around him, knowing that his death was only minutes away. "High Command, these creatures have turned warfare into an art form. They don't fight to win battles, they fight to survive. And they've been practicing survival against their own kind for millennia." The transmission ended as the humans closed in for the kill, moving with the coordinated precision of pack hunters who had finally cornered their prey. Zexkar died fighting, but he died knowing that the hegemony's understanding of warfare had just been shattered by a species that wrote tactical doctrine in the blood of their enemies. In the silence that followed, the survivors of New Jamestown began the grim work of counting their dead and preparing for what they knew would come next. They had won this battle, but they understood enough about the galaxy to know that their victory was also a declaration of war. The hegemony would return with more ships, more soldiers, more weapons. But the humans would be ready. They always were. High Commander Vexithara received Zexkar's final transmission 18 hours after the last Void Hunter had died in the ruins of New Jamestown. The message was fragmented, corrupted by distance and interference, but the essential horror came through with crystal clarity. 5 of the galaxy's most elite warriors had been systematically destroyed by a primitive species that shouldn't have been capable of meaningful resistance. "Impossible," she hissed, her 4 eyes scanning the tactical display for the 3rd time. The intelligence report showed no advanced weapons, No military infrastructure, no unified command structure. How could such creatures defeat even one hunter, let alone 5? Her aide, a young officer named Keshatar, shifted nervously before responding. High Commander, perhaps we should consider that the initial intelligence was flawed. Maybe these humans have hidden capabilities that our scouts failed to detect. Vexithara's laugh was bitter and cold. Hidden capabilities? They use chemical propulsion and kinetic weapons. Their technology is centuries behind our most basic systems. No, something else happened on New Jamestown. Something our psychological profiles failed to predict. She activated the communications array and began sending priority requests to every hegemony monitoring station in the Outer Rim. The responses that came back over the following hours painted a picture that challenged everything the hegemony thought. They knew about galactic warfare. Kepler Station reported losing contact with their reconnaissance team sent to observe the human colony of New Brasilia. Epsilon Outpost had detected weapons fire and explosions on New Sydney, but their follow-up mission had never returned. Monitoring Station 7 had watched 3 separate human settlements under apparent attack, but no victory transmissions had ever been received from the hegemony forces involved. How many? Vexithara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Keshatar consulted his datapad with trembling hands. 47 separate engagements with human colonies in the past 6 months, High Commander. Not one hegemony force has reported successful completion of their missions. Total personnel lost, 3,000 warriors, including 12 Void Hunter teams. The number hit Vexithara like a physical blow. 3,000 of the hegemony's finest warriors, lost to a species that wasn't supposed to pose a threat to a single patrol vessel. She activated the emergency protocols and began downloading every piece of available intelligence on human activities throughout the sector. What she found was worse than she had imagined. The humans hadn't just defended their colonies. They had been studying every attack, analyzing hegemony tactics, technology, and psychological approaches. Each engagement had been a learning experience, and they were adapting faster than any species in recorded galactic history. The intercepted communications between human settlements revealed a level of coordination and strategic thinking that their initial profiles had completely missed. They were sharing information, resources, and tactical innovations across dozens of light years in real time. Every colony that survived an attack became a training ground for the others, spreading knowledge about hegemony weaknesses with ruthless efficiency. But the worst discovery was in the technical analysis of recovered hegemony equipment. The humans were reverse engineering captured technology at an unprecedented rate, not to copy it, but to find new ways to destroy it. They understood weaknesses in energy shielding that hegemony scientists had never considered. They had developed countermeasures to bioenhancement techniques that were supposed to be secret. They're not just defending, Vexithara realized with growing horror. They're learning. Every attack we send teaches them how to kill us more efficiently. The confirmation came in the form of long-range sensor data from the human home system. Where intelligence had expected to find a single primitive world with basic space infrastructure, the scanners revealed something that defied all previous assessments. A massive military buildup that had been carefully hidden from hegemony observation. Human shipyards were producing vessels at an industrial rate that matched hegemony core worlds. Their new designs incorporated lessons learned from every captured piece of alien technology, creating hybrid systems that combined human engineering with stolen galactic innovations. Most terrifying of all, they were building not just defensive platforms but invasion fleets. High Commander. Keshatar's voice was tight with fear. The humans have been tracking our monitoring stations. They know where every hegemony outpost in this sector is located, and they're moving fleet assets into position for coordinated strikes. Vexithara felt the cold touch of something she had never experienced in 3 centuries of conquest. Genuine fear for the survival of her own people.
Send emergency alerts to all hegemony installations within 50 light years of human space.
Full military alert, maximum defensive postures. But even as she issued the orders, she knew it was too late. The humans had been preparing for this moment since their first contact with hegemony forces. Every defensive action had been part of a larger strategy. Every sacrifice made in service of a goal that the hegemony had never anticipated. Total warfare. The first reports of human attacks began arriving within hours. Outpost Gamma 7 went silent after detecting incoming vessels of unknown configuration. Monitoring Station 12 transmitted fragmented distress calls before its signal cut off entirely. Deep space listening posts reported massive fleet movements heading directly toward core hegemony territories. How is this possible? Vexithara demanded, watching her carefully constructed intelligence network dissolve in real time. They're a single-system species with no significant space-based assets. The answer came from an unexpected source, a human transmission broadcast on open channels, clearly intended for hegemony forces to intercept. The voice was calm, professional, and utterly terrifying in its implications. This is Admiral Sarah Chen, commanding the first human expeditionary fleet. To all hegemony forces currently operating in this sector, you have attacked our colonies, killed our civilians, and attempted to enslave our people. This constitutes an act of war against the Human Federation. The transmission continued with devastating clarity. We do not accept your surrender. We do not negotiate with those who target non-combatants. We do not recognize your authority over any inhabited system. You have taught us much about your technology, your tactics, and your weaknesses. We are grateful for the education. Vexithara felt her bio-enhanced heart sink as the human admiral delivered the final element of the message. All hegemony installations in sectors 7 through 12 have been marked for immediate destruction. Evacuation is not an option. This is not a negotiation. This is extermination. The channel closed, leaving the hegemony command center in stunned silence. Around Vexithara, officers who had never known defeat stared at tactical displays showing human fleet movements that seemed to be everywhere at once. The species they had dismissed as primitive savages had just declared war on the galaxy's dominant power, and they seemed confident of victory. Prepare the fleet for immediate departure to the core systems, Vexithara ordered, her voice carrying the weight of absolute command despite the chaos around her. Send word to the Hegemony Council. We are no longer dealing with a primitive species. We're at war with something that understands killing better than we do. As alarms began to sound throughout the command ship, Vexithara found herself facing a truth that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. The hegemony's 300-year reign of galactic dominance was about to be challenged by a species that had spent its entire evolutionary history learning to wage war against itself. The humans were coming, and they were bringing with them every lesson in violence that 10,000 years of human history had taught them. The Galactic Council chambers had not seen such chaos in over a millennium. Representatives from 200 species filled the massive amphitheater, their various forms creating a cacophony of sounds, colors, and biological signals that spoke to panic on a scale that challenged the very foundation of galactic civilization. At the center of it all stood High Commander Vexithara, her scaled features showing the strain of the past several months. Around her neck hung the ceremonial chains of a defeated commander, and her 4 eyes carried the hollow look of someone who had witnessed the impossible. Honorable representatives, she began, her voice amplified throughout the chamber. I stand before you to report the complete military collapse of hegemony forces in sectors 7 through 15. In the span of 6 months, the species known as humans have systematically destroyed over 400 hegemony installations, captured or killed more than 50,000 of our finest warriors, and driven our fleets from 12 star systems. The chamber erupted in a chaos of alien voices, translation systems struggling to keep pace with the rapid exchange of fear, disbelief, and desperate questions. The Zephyrian hegemony had been the galaxy's dominant military power for 3 centuries. The idea that they could be defeated by a single species was almost incomprehensible. Order. The voice belonged to Elder Thrakmor of the Centauran Assembly, whose species had been among the first to submit to hegemony rule. High Commander, explain how a primitive species with no significant military history could achieve such impossible results. Vexithara activated a holographic display that showed the tactical analysis of human warfare methods. Honorable Elder, our initial assessment was catastrophically incorrect. Humans are not a primitive species. They are the most militarily sophisticated civilization the galaxy has ever encountered. The display showed footage from the few hegemony survivors who had managed to escape human attacks. The images were horrifying. Entire planets turned into fortress worlds, civilian populations that fought with the intensity of elite soldiers, children who constructed weapons from debris and used them with lethal effectiveness. They do not distinguish between soldiers and civilians in their defensive strategy, Vexithara continued, her voice growing quieter as the chamber fell silent. Every human is a potential combatant. They have no concept of surrender, no understanding of defeat. When we destroy their ships, they use the wreckage as weapons. When we kill their warriors, their families take up arms to avenge them. The holographic display shifted to show intelligence gathered from intercepted human communications. The data painted a picture of a species that had been at war with itself for millennia, developing tactics and strategies that made hegemony military doctrine look like children's games. Their entire civilization is built around conflict, Vexthara explained. They have weapons designed specifically to kill other humans, tactics developed through thousands of years of warfare against their own species, and a psychological makeup that treats violence as a natural response to threats. We thought we were fighting a primitive enemy. We were actually challenging the galaxy's apex predator. Representative Cattell of the Saurian Confederacy raised a claw. High Commander, surely their primitive technology limits their effectiveness. Our intelligence reports showed they lack energy weapons and advanced shielding systems. Vexithara's laugh was bitter and empty. Representative Cattell, their primitive kinetic weapons are more effective against our energy shields than our own weapons are against theirs. They use chemical explosives with precision that our bio-enhanced warriors cannot match, and they learn from every engagement, adapting their tactics faster than we can develop countermeasures. The holographic display now showed recent sensor data from the edges of human space, massive fleets of hybrid vessels that combined human engineering with captured alien technology, moved with purpose toward the core systems of the galaxy. Their numbers were staggering, their coordination perfect, and their intent unmistakable. They are no longer merely defending their colonies, Vexthara announced, her words falling like stones into the silence of the chamber. Human fleets are advancing on our core systems. They have studied our technology, reverse-engineered our weapons, and identified the locations of every major hegemony installation within 200 light-years of their space. The implications hit the assembled representatives like a physical blow. If the humans were advancing toward hegemony core systems, they were also advancing toward the homeworlds of every species that had allied with the hegemony over the past 3 centuries. What do they want? Asked Ambassador Veltek of the Rigelian Trade Union, her voice barely above a whisper. Surely they can be reasoned with, negotiated with. Vexthara activated a recording of the final human transmission that had been broadcast to every hegemony installation before the attacks began. Admiral Sarachen's voice filled the chamber with calm, professional certainty that was more terrifying than any battle cry could have been. To all species currently allied with or subject to the Zephyrian hegemony, you have a choice. Withdraw your support for hegemony operations immediately and return to your home systems, or be treated as enemy combatants. We do not negotiate with those who attack civilian populations. We do not accept surrender from those who enslave other species. You have 48 standard hours to comply. The chamber erupted again, but this time the chaos was driven by desperate attempts to find some path to survival. Representatives who had spent centuries as part of the galaxy's dominant alliance were suddenly faced with a choice that could determine the fate of their entire species. They're offering us a way out, Elder Thrackmore said, his ancient voice cutting through the noise. If we abandon the hegemony, they will let us live. And if we don't? Representative Cattell asked, though the answer was already clear from the tactical displays showing the destruction of hegemony installations. Vexithara looked around the chamber at species that had once trembled before hegemony might. If you don't comply, you will face the same fate as our military installations. The humans don't just defeat their enemies, they eliminate them completely. There is no surrender, no mercy, no negotiation. There is only survival or extinction. Over the next several hours, the Galactic Council witnessed something unprecedented in galactic history. The complete dissolution of the most powerful military alliance the galaxy had ever known. Species after species formally withdrew their support for the hegemony, recalled their fleets to home systems, and prepared to face an uncertain future under the shadow of human expansion. By the time the session ended, the Zephyrian hegemony stood alone, abandoned by every ally, facing an enemy that had turned warfare into an evolutionary advantage. Vexithara found herself commanding the remnants of a once mighty empire against a species that had spent 10,000 years learning to kill each other and had now turned that expertise toward the stars. 3 days later, human fleets arrived in the Zephyrian home system. The battle was brief, decisive, and documented by long-range sensors throughout the galaxy. The hegemony's core defensive fleet, supported by orbital platforms that had never been breached, lasted less than 6 hours against human tactics that treated every defensive position as a puzzle to be solved. When the silence finally fell over what had once been the capital of galactic civilization, the surviving species of the galaxy faced a new reality. Humanity had not just defeated the hegemony, they had demonstrated that they were the new apex predator in a galaxy that was suddenly very much more dangerous. The humans, however, did not establish an empire to replace the hegemony. Instead, they returned to their expanding colonies and continued their quiet exploration of the galaxy, leaving behind only a simple message for any species brave enough to listen. We came in peace. We offered trade, cooperation, and friendship. You responded with demands for tribute, threats of conquest, and attacks on our families. We have taught you the consequences of that choice. We suggest you remember the lesson, and across the galaxy on 1,000 worlds and in the chambers of 100 governments, the lesson was indeed remembered. Humanity had earned their place among the stars not through conquest or domination, but by demonstrating that some species should never be underestimated, never be threatened, and never, ever be pushed to the point where they had nothing left to lose. The galaxy had a new rule. Leave the humans alone and they will leave you alone. But attack them, threaten their families, or attempt to enslave their people, and discover why a species that had spent millennia perfecting the art of killing its own kind made the most dangerous enemy the galaxy had ever seen. The hegemony had sent their strongest against the humans. Not one had returned, and in that failure, they had taught the galaxy a lesson that would be remembered for generations to come. Never underestimate a species that calls warfare an art form.